morning, good afternoon, good evening. The other day I covered the story of the violence, petrol bombing of an opposition candidate in the ongoing by-election in one of the Harare suburbs, Glenview. Today, I've got a video clip showing the details of the damage to the property, two properties. I'll just show one. And the victim of the bombing. Just quickly listen to this.
Takaitirwa udambudziko kuti takaunganidzwawo panze pakuputika mushure mekunge tese takararana asi takanga takakurudara tese takafumidza kurara vana pataimu yakaputika vakatokuva kuti magetsi aputika asi patakazoda bhacho pavava kuzara dzakatokuva kuti magetsi aputika asi takazoona kuti aiwa mapodhoro anga atozaramo saka tichizobuda panze takabva taona mota dzese dzakadhisturbeka dzakadonha dzimwe dzakaputika mavhiri chinova chiitiko chandishamisa kuti chingava chii asi ndikunzwa kurwadziwa nazvo nekuti mota dzangu dziri mbiri dzaparara kuti nhumba magirasi ese adora asi handisi kuziva hangu kuti angava akazviita ndiyani pazva zvichangoitika pa10 minutes zvaitika ndafonera polisi saka pandafonera pisi yangu ndafonera mapurisa azouya after 30 minutes zvavasvikawo mapurisa ndopavabva vatora statement vachindibvudzawo kuti chii chaitika zvavazoenda pavadzoka vavasiya vamwe 3 varara vakachengeta saka pazouya futi rimwe bhuku remapurisa makusei vachouya kuzotarisa pakuti tisaone chamunobata mvuru yeforensics vachanga saka vazoenda nashure memuti mauya vazopedzisira kuuya masoja ndovazouya pekupedzisira vachouya kuzotarisa kuti chirara chii chakaitika.
Zvaitika ndezvokuti tenge takarara kudaro dzakuma 1 am 5 past 1 10 past 1 am.
You can stop it there. This is a recurring story, especially during election periods in Zimbabwe. The culture of violence is an integral part of Zimbabwe's electoral process. The violence is there, but also the process itself is flawed. Zanu PF is renowned for its blatant cheating and rigging. What is shocking here is that this has been going on since the country's independence in 1980. Why are we failing to hold free, fair, and credible elections? The answer to that is very simple. We are failing because Zanu PF cannot risk holding free, fair, and credible elections for fear that it will lose. So it is in Zanu PF's interest to rig the elections. Then the logical question is, why are the people themselves putting up with it? To be quite honest, the people have done their best to try to end this culture. By the late 1990s, the people of Zimbabwe finally realized that as long as Zanu PF is able to rig the elections, there will be no meaningful change in the country. So the nation had two options. Either to go back to the bush to fight the regime, just as they had done a decade earlier before that during the Liberation War, to fight to end white colonial rule, or to elect opposition members who will force democratic changes. They know the process, the electoral process is flawed, so electing an opposition into power would be impossible because Zanu PF rigged the elections. But they also realize that the opposition, they can still elect a few opposition members who will be able to force the regime to implement democratic reforms. This was the wiser option. And the movement for democratic change of Morgan Tsvangirai and his friends stepped in, offering the nation to bring about those democratic change. The party's name itself said it all. This is a movement for democratic change. The people risked their lives, their livelihoods, and limbs to elect the MDC leaders into positions of power so that they could implement the democratic reforms. That was their number one priority. The tragedy, however, is that when those MDC leaders were elected in the positions where they could effect meaningful democratic change, they sold out. It is a historic fact that during the 2008 to 2018, Zimbabwe had its golden opportunity to bring about democratic changes in Zimbabwe. SADC had forced Zanu PF to sign the Global Political Agreement of 2008, which gave birth to the GNU. And the primary purpose of the GNU was to implement the democratic reforms. And yet, at the end of the day, at the end of the GNU, not even one token reform had been implemented. This has been the problem with Zimbabwe. People risked livelihoods, limbs, and lives to elect the opposition with the primary purpose of implementing the democratic reforms to stop Zanu PF rigging the elections. Unfortunately, the opposition turned out to be incredibly incompetent and corrupt. Mugabe had no problem bribing Morgan Tsvangirai and company with the trappings of high office to forget about the reforms. And ever since the GNU debacle, MDC leaders have been participating in these flawed elections out of greed. It's not as if these opposition leaders don't know it. They know it. This is what is so annoying about our situation. They know that the process, the electoral process in Zimbabwe is flawed and illegal. So flawed, so illegal that the only logical step is to withdraw. This is a quotation from David Coltart, one of the leading opposition MDC leaders. But in it, it also explains why haven't they withdrawn. The explanation is they could not withdraw because they feared that the other opposition leaders would participate and win the few seats, gravy train seats, that the new Zanu PF was dangling to entice the opposition to keep participating. In other words, the opposition has been participating in these flawed elections out of greed, pure and simple. Greed. As much as these opposition councillors are having their houses bombed and so forth, they will still participate out of greed. SADC, who have been observing Zimbabwe's elections, in 2023, SADC did the nation a great favor. They condemned the elections in Zimbabwe. For what they are, flawed. And this is the basis for saying, so why are we keeping on participating in a process that even the people who are coming in to observe them are saying this is a flawed process? The leaders themselves, the opposition leaders, like I said, they're participating out of greed. But what about the ordinary people? Well, the ordinary people have been participating in these flawed elections because they've turned out to be incredibly ignorant, naive, and gullible. So gullible that they're easily conned. While the leaders themselves are participating out of greed, of course, they would not tell their supporters that we are participating out of greed. They have to tell them something else. And they've been telling the people that they're participating because the opposition has found strategies of winning rigged elections. In 2023, Chamisa told his supporters that he had plugged all the vote rigging loopholes. CCC was going to win big. There was no way CCC was not going to win. They were going to win big. No, just win big. And a few days before the elections, he was telling his supporters that he was already preparing his cabinet. He even invoked the name of God. Here he is speaking about his preparations to form the new government.
Makorokoto Zimbabwe nokuti hakuna munhu anomira kana denga raronga plan. Denga raronga plan, denga harifo iri. Plan yaMwari haifo iri. Ini ndatanga kugadzira cabinet. There is no way we are not going to form a new cabinet. There is no way we are not going to have a celebration. There is no way we are not going to have an inauguration. Let's start preparing for our inauguration. Let's start preparing for our celebration.
The truth is, of course, he was lying. It was an idiotic lie. And yet millions of Zimbabweans believed it. And this has been at the heart of Zimbabwe's political crisis. We have an incredibly ignorant, gullible, and naive electorate who are easily conned. The Greeks, 2,500 years ago, when they started experimenting with democracy, they realized that democracy will only work if the people are educated, knowledgeable, diligent, objective, and most important of all, they are diligent in their duty to hold those leaders to account. Chamisa lied that he had plugged the vote-rigging loopholes, because the day after the voting was done, he was the first one to admit that Zanu PF had rigged the elections. And yet the people themselves have failed to hold him to account. Indeed, one of the things that many of us who have questioned Chamisa's lies found was, if you want to annoy the Chamisa Chete Chete brigade, mention the word that Chamisa lied. They don't want it to be said. And anyone who says it is public enemy number one, of course, it's foolish. This is a people who cannot face the truth. Here is the BBC journalist who did hold Chamisa to account on his blatant lies.
Ende patakasangana na Trump akatibvunza navakomana mari yamuri kuda kuti nyika ifambe imari.
Serious questions were raised about your behaviour in Washington, D.C. You did see some senior people on Capitol Hill, some Congress people, but you also claimed that you'd seen Donald Trump. You claimed you had a conversation with him in which you said he asked you how much you needed to move the country forward. You told him $15 billion, and he said to you that he would provide the money if you won the election. That was not true, was it?
Sangana na Trump akatibvunza navakomana.
It was not true that you'd seen Donald Trump and that Donald Trump indicated to you that he would provide, if you won the election, $15 billion.
All those statements were said by other people, not what I said.
Well, no, because there is a video which shows you at a rally in January back home in Zimbabwe saying that Donald Trump had pretty much promised you $15 billion. To be clear, because some people in Zimbabwe are still confused, you're now telling me you did not meet Donald Trump.
We did not.
The tragedy with Zimbabwe is that as much as SADC and the AU condemned Zimbabwe's 2023 elections, They could not go on and do the next rational thing, deny Zanu PF political legitimacy, because Zimbabweans themselves had participated in those flawed elections in their millions. And here we are, having a by-election. There's not been even one token reform implemented, and Zimbabweans are still participating. And in 2028, when the next elections are due, Zimbabweans will still participate. That is the tragedy of Zimbabwe. We don't even have the common sense to admit it to ourselves that the electoral process is flawed. Even when those who are the referees, SADC, the AU, are telling us that this process is flawed. SADC and the AU will not expect us to participate in a flawed process. So why are we participating? And why are we participating in our millions? By participating, we are giving Zanu PF legitimacy. That point cannot be denied. It is interesting to note that the Greeks, or those 2,500 years ago, realized the common sense of having an electorate that is educated, that is knowledgeable, that is objective. They realized the sheer folly of having an electorate that is naive, ignorant, and so gullible that they will be conned into participating in an electoral process to give the vote-rigging party legitimacy and to perpetuate their own suffering. And yet, this is where we are. This is Zimbabwe in a nutshell. 2,500 years after the ancient Greeks realized it, with all the benefit of history, we still cannot grasp the sheer foolishness of participating in a flawed process. This is not the last act of violence. The Zanu PF feels that their hold on power is threatened. They have upped the ante, used violence. The vote rigging is still going on, of course. These by-elections are going ahead, and yet there is no verified voters' roll. That has not stopped the opposition participating. That has not stopped their supporters participating. At least in the urban centers, Zanu PF let the opposition win a few seats. In the rural area, there's not a chance. We have a failed political system. But one of the main reasons why we have a failed political system is because we ourselves have failed ourselves we have failed to learn even the most common sense things, like what constitutes free, fair, and credible elections. How anyone in this day and age could still believe they could win rigged elections, blatantly rigged, to the point where one can say this process is so flawed, so illegal, the only logical thing to do is to withdraw. And yet some people still continue to participate. Beggars belief. But this is where we are. This is Zimbabwe in a nutshell. Thank you very much. Have a good day.